In today's episode, my friend Wayne Jett and I discuss money, history, economics, and his book, The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now. We had fun, we enjoyed it, and hope you do as well. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the Banking with Life podcast. I'm your host, James Neathery, and I'm as excited as I can be to have the guest Wayne Jett on today. And I'm excited that you have the opportunity to discover who this man is, his background, and his work. And we're going to ultimately get to his book, The Fruits of Graft. So welcome, Wayne Jett. I appreciate you coming on and podcasting with me.
Thanks a lot, James. I'm delighted to have the invitation and look forward to our discussion.
Perfect. Now, Wayne, as I kind of said earlier, we haven't had a lot of discussions before now, maybe a phone call and a couple of emails when I purchased your book. And I purchased your book, The Fruits of Graft, about a year and a half ago. And I discovered you and even was exposed to your book on Sarah Westfall's podcast. And there's a lot of content out on the internet where you have interviewed with a multiple of podcasters, and I encourage the listeners to search for Wayne Jett and listen to him and his interviews. What I'd like to do today, Wayne, is to get to your background. I want the listeners to know who you are, your background, and because argued before the Supreme Court as an attorney. That's impressive. And then moving into the financial world, discovering kind of what's going on, and then, the genesis of your work that really produced this book, and then what you've done and what you're currently doing. So that's kind of what I would like for you to go through, if you don't mind.
Well, thanks. I'll be happy to do that. I will just try to be as brief as possible about my background, but I grew up in a family. My father was a farmer. He was basically broke in the Great Depression. He became a sharecropper. Married my mother, who was maybe half his age, but basically he was born in 1900, so you can see how old he was during the 30s. And it's a very great struggle, and travel around the country trying to find a job of any kind to bring in any kind of money. That little town we moved into when I was, probably 8 or 9 years old. We moved in from the farm because we got foreclosed on. Because I'm sure the prices for cattle and beef and so forth. My dad was raising a few cows. They got taken by the bank. I didn't know about this at that time as to why we moved, but we moved into town. And I wound up having I went to the same schools in my little town for my entire elementary and high school education. And by the time I got through those terrific teachers I had, all the way from first through the 12th, I was an honor student in both English, but I was an engineering student. And not only that, but the University of Oklahoma, where I attended, just absolutely, I cannot believe how well I was taken care of while I was there. In my sophomore year, basically after selling Cokes and in the football stadium and delivering mail around campus in my first freshman year, first semester, and then working zoology, lab and that sort of thing. I got a job due to the influence of my counselor in engineering. He got me a job at the University Research Institute, and I was trained and got good pay for writing proposals. I became a technical writer for them. From there, I was hired on to one of the projects that an engineering professor got doing classified research for the Defense Department. That was after a couple of years, so I felt I'd gotten quite a bit of experience as a technical writer. And they hired me basically to do writing and research of that kind. I wound up writing the report for that. And then I got hired by the Continuing Education Center, a man that become acquainted with back in high school because he had been our football coach for 1 year before he got reactivated in the military. He had played OU football. And so I could get, it's so easy to get into the weeds here with so many details. But he hired me away from that after that research project was done to work in his Office of Special Projects at the Continuing Education Center. And he was a very innovative fellow. He had developed an advanced program in governmental studies, a Master of Arts degree for people already working. It became a sensation in the country. And I was his number 2 guy, basically administratively. We went back to Washington together to try to find people to do contractual work with and things of that sort. That was in 1963 or so, and or 64 actually. But in any event, he was such a hit with that program that he had developed. He was hired away from the university, and as his assistant, I then became his director as soon as I got my degree in engineering, which 1965, and I finished my law degree in January 67. And so I was director of an office that he had already established an office in Washington, D.C., the first one for any university, I believe. And so all of that really, it was a tremendous experience. I had some of the most interesting work I ever did in my life while I was still at the university. That Office of Advanced Studies that I was director of, I hired staff in Europe. We had classes taught there as well as at the Strategic Air Command headquarters. We had NASA students. We had all sorts of bright people, including Director of Personnel at NASA, Art Sanderson at the time, from Marshall Space Flight Center, was one of my students, one of my friends. I mean, I wasn't a teacher in that program. I was the administrator. But it was a tremendously interesting time of my life. I traveled to Europe, to Britain, and so forth, and looking at visiting military bases and getting acquainted with people. Went to a number of universities around the Southwest, organizing an alliance for Latin America with a professor there at the university that specialized in that area. So I really had a very broad experience. I just can't believe how well they took care of me. And all of that is largely at the time I was a student, as well as then a couple of years thereafter. Then I decided the last thing I wrote or did for the university in my position, other than being administrator of that advanced program, was I wrote a proposal the university needed submitted to get the first Postal Research Institute. And it got a couple of $1 million, which was big money in those days. It bought a lot of things. And as soon as I did that, I resigned from my position there because I needed to start practicing law. And I actually wanted to practice in Oklahoma, but I couldn't find a job. And so I took a position that turned out to be very worthwhile in Los Angeles. For a small firm that had a tremendous practice in the field I was interested in, labor law. And so I joined that firm, and I was with them for a couple of years, when of all things I was asked if I would separate from the firm and become the primary counsel for a set of institutional sized employee benefit trusts, a large pension plan, a large healthcare plan, a large training program for apprentices in the craft of operating engineers, The man who hired me to do that, in large part, was the head of the union, even though I had been with a management law firm. And it happened, I learned later, that his background was he had grown up in the Bakersfield area, around a lot of people who had to immigrate there from Oklahoma in the Depression. And he had such respect for the people he had grown up with that he thought I might be another honest one. And by and large, it developed into a long-term relationship, although unfortunately, he retired just a few years after that. But my relationship with those employee benefit trust funds lasted for something like 28 years, thereabouts. And it was a tremendous opportunity to influence the development of law relating to the enforcement of employee benefits. There was no law in the federal courts at that time, even though it was a federal law that authorized the plans in the first place. And largely my firm did the litigation in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit that largely established the case law in the country for how those contracts, those labor agreements were to be enforced so that the employee benefits could be adequately secured. Because they were a lot of money paid by employers, and some employers cut corners and didn't pay properly. And it had to be enforced, and I think we did a good job of that. That's how largely I got into the Supreme Court, but unfortunately, the bad part of that story is that the Congress double-crossed the employers in 1974. The great thing about the labor laws at that point had been to say to labor and the employers, you make your agreement and your agreement will be enforced. The government will not be superimposing our own requirements on you. You make your agreement and we'll live with it. Well, in 74, they reneged on that. And basically, in order to, I think, centralize more government power, as our governments tend to do, they passed a law that says, well, we're going to guarantee, supposedly we're going to insure pensions. And therefore, instead of just letting the employer agree to pay a certain amount of money in and the pension plan then manage the funds and invest it in such a way as to provide the best pension it can, we're going to say that the employer has to underwrite whatever the pension eventually costs over and above the cents per hour or the dollars per hour that they pay in on each employee that works for them. Well, that entirely corrupted the whole legal system and contractual system that those pension plans were based on. And it really caused a great unsettlement of the tremendous growth and the benefits that those programs had done by putting the employers in the position of being unsure how much they might eventually have to pay when they're construction projects and they live contract to contract. But yet what it amounted to is on that, I'll try to wind that discussion up, but it's becomes directly involved, and that was one of the two cases that I took to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. It was called the Connelly versus Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. That was just a boondoggle that basically charged money to all of the good trust funds around the country, the ones that were well run, took the money and put it into a pot and went back and paid the benefits that had been stolen from the ones back in the New York East Coast area, which was the area that the author of that bill, Jacob Javits in the Senate, came from. And I knew it was going to be a boondoggle that would blow up all the trusts and so forth, and that's exactly what it's done. The Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation has gone bankrupt and yet it also unsettled all of the trust funds around the country, made the employers want to get out of it. There was one fund, one small employer down in San Diego who actually he had a lawyer that volunteered to represent him in the case as an intervener. And basically that was a guy who, with his family, had developed just a small sand and gravel company. And because of this law, even though he had paid all of his contractual contributions, he was liable for over $1 million on this pension benefit guarantee corporation on something he had never agreed to pay. Now, $1 million to $1.5 million for that guy was his entire net worth that he had developed over in his little company of 10 or 12 employees doing small construction projects. That wiped out thousands of small employers like that across the country just because of the power of the federal government to step in and undo and break the contracts that private individuals had made. I took the case to the Supreme Court on the basis that it was a violation of the taking clause. It was a passage of a law taking private property money from one private person and giving it to another, a private pension plan. And that's most clearly a violation of the Fifth Amendment, the taking clause. There was precedent to hold that way. I had them dead to rights, and I lost 9-0 in the Supreme Court. A so-called conservative Supreme Court, and they didn't even face up to even answering the questions of why they were doing this, other than that they had done it before. They had allowed the government to do these kind of things under the Due Process Clause, which does nothing except guarantee you a hearing before they hang you. So in that circumstance, it was a very demoralizing thing. I had 2 cases in the Supreme Court. I won one of them 9-0, and yet it was just as dishonest and harmful to my client. Even though they supposedly let us win it, it was a collective bargaining type case. I won't get into it. But it was a very demoralizing thing as a lawyer to finally get to the Supreme Court and to find what irresolute, dishonest reasoning they were willing to use in order to produce a result, no matter what the right and the wrong of it was, and no matter what the Constitution or the federal law would say. So much political, as we have seen in spades, particularly in these last 2 years with the election of President Donald Trump and the kinds of things that our government institutions do. Now that's, I haven't even gotten out of my law practice of this thing, and I've taken quite a lot of time.
Right, but look, talking about the PBGC and was that the ERISA Act in 1974?
That's correct. That's what it was.
It did a
lot of harm when it could have done some good. But nevertheless, that was my background, and long about the year 98, 2000, 2002, I was largely getting out of the legal practice and was more interested in the financial world, getting into that and trying to study to understand better how I might protect what assets I had left earned during my legal career. And I studied economics on my own, and particularly was interested in so-called supply-side economics. And I concluded on myself that that was really classical economic theory. It just had a new name. But I discovered Jude Winniski, who had named it supply-side economics, and Art Laffer. Jude Winniski had a small money management advisory economic forecasting firm called Polynomics. it really wasn't money management. I have to correct that. It was advisory, economic analysis for market participants. And their clients were large asset management companies and things of that sort. And I began communicating with him. He wound up hiring me to be his representative in the Western states. So basically a commission basis to try to get institutions to use his work. I think and thought then that he was the best economic forecaster. His record was better than anyone else for the last 25 years or so, 23 years of the 20th century and into the 21st. But his client base was relatively very small compared to the larger firms that had the capability to produce a lot of graphics and show and tell for clients of the wealth management firms, even though their records were not nearly as good as his in terms of understanding what the economy was doing and going to do. In the process of representing him with other clients or prospects, I did some writing for him as well. He and I actually published a co-authored article in one of the Washington newspapers. I think it was the Examiner. And so it was an interesting time to learn more about economics. He was certainly, I think, an important figure in that. He had written an important book called The Way the World Works. And he believed, Jude Wanniski believed, that he had explained the Great Crash because he had been able to tie together the occurrence, the specific time of the occurrence of a vote on the Senate floor regarding the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Each time there was a vote on the floor of the Senate in October of 1929, in which the vote advanced the cause of the Smoot-Hawley Act, there was an immediate crash of major proportions. That was the Great Crash of 1929. And he explained it that way in his book. And that book actually was named as one of the 100 most influential books of the 20th century, The Way the World Works. And so I knew he was disenchanted by the fact that the major economic spokespeople, the academicians and so forth, did not give his book any credit, didn't really give it attention as explaining the Great Crash. They just sort of let it happen, and he got the following that he got, but no accolades from the economic community. Well, along in that period of time, after a year or two with him, I learned pretty clearly that I could not write anything about what concerned me in the investment community about financial fraud. If I mentioned that or brought it up, it was quieted down in a hurry, and certainly I wasn't allowed to put anything in print. And so it came to my knowledge, in effect, that you just aren't permitted to say anything about financial fraud if you want to work in the financial industry. And
I'm shocked.
Of course, we learned in spades later, after the Madoff scandal, in which the very celebrated, a very accomplished man in the Chartered Financial Analysts Society. He was the president of the Chartered Financial Analysts of Boston. He was a quant. And so I'm sure you understand that terminology. He was very well capable. The man who was trying to blow the whistle at the SEC for 8 years and got no response from them on Bernie Madoff, telling them that it was a fraud. He was basically drummed out of the business. after he was learned to have, he was unemployable, became unemployable as soon as it became known that he was the one who tried to get Bernie Madoff busted by the SEC, unsuccessfully, until the scandal broke and there was a 50, well, whatever it was I think $50 billion or something of the sort. So in that circumstance, while I was still working for Jude, I started doing a little research on my own because I didn't believe either the stories that the financial community spread, that the Great Depression was just too complicated, too complex. They couldn't put their finger on what caused it. But it just seemed to be one of those things that they, by the kind of commentary about it, it was the failings of human beings, too greedy or too positive or too negative, or like Roosevelt supposedly was saying, is that the fear is what's causing this, so we just have to conquer our own fears and it'll be okay. So I started looking. I had been interested for some time, but I really did not want to write a book. I wrote a small one earlier, and it's a lot of work and very little reward for what you do. But I stuck my nose into looking at a multi-volume work that was the published, edited personal diary of the man who was the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury for FDR, practically the entire time, except for the first year when another man preceded him. This man was Secretary of the Treasury the entire time, and he kept a personal diary daily. And a Yale professor of his history had edited his diary along with the help of Henry Morgenthau Jr. And in that circumstance, I thought maybe he would reveal some things there that hadn't been talked about or admitted to. And so I started looking. Like a needle in a haystack, but I had enough exposure to Jude Wanniski and classical economics. I thought I knew something of what would be important if I found it. And so in that circumstance, I started looking, and it wasn't very long before I found something that I thought was important enough. I had to mention it to Jude. I did so on the phone, and Jude immediately says, "You've got to write a book." I thought it was that important, and I'm sure that Jude, knowing how hard it is, didn't say that lightly, because it is a lot of work, and it was certainly the last thing I wanted to hear, because frankly, I was trying to make money. I was trying to make a living, and hopefully trying to do it in a way that would assist my family and also be successful in the work that I was trying to do. But unfortunately, it wasn't more than 4 or 5 months later that Jude Wanniski passed away of a heart attack at the age of 69. And the firm that he had created and was running at the time, Paul Economics, essentially ended at the end of that year. And so I was on my own. He and I, at the time, frankly, had been planning. I was already in the process of setting up an independent firm with him to manage money according to his views. Because nobody had fully done that yet, although he had a number of money managers who used his firm. But of course, with his death, that went by the wayside. And in any event, that's a long-winded approach toward my background and how I got into this. But if you still have the time on this discussion, I'll be happy, James, to go ahead and start telling you what I found.
I do have time, Wayne, and I appreciate the detail of your background. I mean, educated as an engineer, an attorney, and then into the financial world. There's a reason that there's so many footnotes and documentation in your book. So much documentation in your book. So thank you for that. And yes, let's please continue.
All right.
It sounds to me, if I'm just a listener, Wayne, it sounds like that was really a whole discovery process, step by step, and kind of like a mosaic being put together piece by piece. Very interesting. I would say that after that first piece, and Jude's comment, I almost was repulsed by that. I'm not going to do any more research because this is just too big a thing. This is not the way I want to spend my time. I need to earn a living. But nevertheless, particularly with Jude's early death, I decided that, if there's something there, I've got a responsibility to find it, because at least I think what to look for and where to look and so forth. And so I continued, got back into those same diaries of the Morgenthau Diaries as edited. And I found a lot more. I found things that I knew were so important I couldn't let it down. I had to do my job. I had to take my responsibility and record it, because if I didn't, it was clear nobody else had and nobody else would. At least it hasn't happened otherwise until then. And I haven't found anybody else, particularly those in the academic community. It's like the same thing with that happened with Madoff. People in the academic community apparently are not permitted to talk about these kinds of things. Even after my book came out, describing and defining in detail the role that FDR played in the Great Depression, another academic book came out praising him for being a traitor to his class. Oh, yeah. He's a demigod. So
I'm still at the point, even though my book was published in 2011, in mid-2011, here we are in 2019, it is still in the phase that it is ignored rather than commented upon. So far as the academic community is concerned, with very few exceptions, the academic community has ignored it. They do not buy it. They do not use it in their classes. I've had many comments from readers that it ought to be in classes. I think it's readable, perhaps even at the high school level, but certainly at the college level. And I think it treats economics, classical economics, treats economics in a much more understandable way by far than Keynesian economics does, which is entirely a deceptive mechanism trying to lead people away from understanding the economy and what is being done by policymakers and what their real motives are. So I've explained that. For example, there's a chapter in my book devoted to Keynesian analysis and what it's all about. And there's no question in my mind, it is not only flat out wrong in many of its basic premises, but it is purposely so from the standpoint that it tries to make things very complex rather than simplifying them. I say, for example, that in wages, they make wages so hard to understand as to what they're all about that you wonder how anybody ever got a job from anyone. And so you put that into overall concept, it really is a way to confuse people and to obfuscate so they really don't know what policymakers are doing or what the effects are. And yet, because the big money is behind the Keynesianism, what I call the Kingmakers Cabal that tries to run every country is in the driver's seat so far as our universities are concerned, and it's a great tragedy.
Yes.
I think even in my lifetime, there's been the change in our universities from teaching classical economics, which guided the country well through the 19th century. That was when we had our greatest economic growth so far as the middle class is concerned. And that is why, as I relate in my book, that as of 1900, there was an express written in English plan to destroy the middle class worldwide, especially in the United States, but worldwide. That means the middle class, not just middle income earners, but the middle class includes everyone capable of supporting themselves and their families with their work and labor. Even the lower middle class, they're supported at a low standard of living, but nevertheless, they support themselves. They're not slaves to the state. They're not slaves to the king. That's what the middle class is. And there was an express written plan in English to destroy that middle class entirely, to destroy all nations that are using so-called democracy, so that once and for all it would be made clear and predominant that other human beings other than the ruling class do not have a say in the way they live or their rights and obligations. They are a slave class to serve the rulers. That was the written plan published in 1901 that immediately got the author of it, a British author by the name of H.G. Wells, an invitation immediately to the White House of Theodore Roosevelt as the honored guest on the arm of the woman who was the creator of Planned Parenthood. Her name escapes me right at this second, but I'm sure everyone, Sanger, Margaret Sanger.
Yeah, Sanger, yeah.
And Wells came out of that meeting as the honored guest at the U.S. White House of Theodore Roosevelt, calling Theodore Roosevelt the demigod of whom I have dreamed. He was invited to the palaces of Europe. He was made an immediate academic all-star for the rest of his life. He visited for weeks at a time in the White House of Theodore Roosevelt and Eleanor. And he visited Stalin at the Kremlin, celebrated in each of those places. And of course, he made each of those people heroes in terms of their leadership of the world in the direction that it was going. For example, he called the kitchen cabinet, or no, that's not what it was called for Roosevelt. He had this cadre of people who advised him, and he called H.G. Wells called those men the new man that's capable of taking absolute power. That's the point about all of this, the written plan that had been put into effect to destroy the middle class, to destroy democracy. By the year 2000, to learn how to poison all of the people that they did not need, what they call the people of the abyss. This is a gruesome thing, and yet it is the reality of our history. And at this point, I think it would be important to go specifically into the actions taken to cause the Great Depression. The crash of 1929, I learned after I researched it. I learned as I was finishing my book, after I had done the research of what was done to cause it, I learned about its pre-planning as well. I'll get to that later. But the crash of 29 was pre-planned. But it got it going, and Hoover did three things to help it get going. The first was there was widespread belief that the crash of 29 was not only premeditated, but it was caused by very widespread, heavy financial fraud in the markets. That is, doing what they call watering the stock, selling counterfeit shares that they didn't own. We call it naked short selling today. But many shares counterfeited by selling them short when they don't exist, making the price crash. That's what caused those 5 big days of the great crash. And it was done. What I added to the explanation that Jude Winniski had made, he had found that they occurred right at the time of those votes, and therefore he thought it was the significance of the votes that caused the crash that day. Well, my belief is that the votes had been agreed to as being the signal, so that all the ones in the plan, all of the big traders on Wall Street, all the big banks, and their cohorts and the ones who profited by knowing what they were doing, everybody would sell short at the time of those votes. That's what made the crash. And it was cunningly picked as the signal because it could be used as an excuse saying that, well, this was going to wreck world trade. And that's why supposedly the market was afraid of what it was going to do to world trade. Well, okay. But world trade was not that important to the U.S. market at that time. It would not have caused that large a reaction, but it did cause it because they premeditated and they pre-planned to use that as the signal to do their naked shorting. And therefore, they could sell short knowing that it was going to be driven to the bottom then. Then they could recover again at a very low price, write it back up, and then do it all again, which is exactly what they did. That was the situation, and yet Hoover did nothing about it. That was his number one wrong, and the first wrong that he did. The second thing he did, he signed Smoot-Hawley, the tariff bill that within 18 months of the date that he signed it, which was in June of 1930, 18 months later, at the end of 32, unemployment was 25% and higher. And we had lost 70% of our export trade and 70% of our import trade, all of which he could have stopped with a word to the Senate that he didn't want it passed. Or he certainly could have vetoed it. It only passed by 3 votes. No chance it would have passed if he had vetoed it. And he should have known that it would be damaging. There was no reason to shut other people out of selling here because we had, it was a small part of our total economy. It just wasn't that important. And yet he caused this trade war in the entire world. Then with all of that, with unemployment at the end of 1931 at something like 30% or more, He's going to be running for office in 32 again. That's his fourth year in office as president. And Hoover has the bright idea that he's going to be affirmative and have a giant tax increase, income taxes, quadruples the lowest rate from 1% to 4%, and expands it a lot to cover a lot more incomes, people who hadn't even had to pay income tax before. And the top rate of 25%, he tripled to 75% or thereabouts. And that was to be passed and was passed by the Democrats in 1932. And of course, Hoover was blown out of office and would have been ridden out of town on a rail if people had the time to do it. So he deserved to be out of office for those three things. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in order to undo those three things. And he sort of indicated in his campaign that's what he'd be doing. But of course, once he got elected, he did exactly the opposite. He didn't repeal the income taxes. In fact, every year he was in office, during his 4 elected terms until his death, he raised taxes and or added new taxes every year, except 1939. And I'll tell you later why he didn't do it then. It was because Congress would not do it, because the Democrats, then controlling the House, had lost 83 seats in the 38 elections. So that explains the 1 year. And he was insisting that entire year that they raise taxes, and even the Democratic House would not pass a bill to do it. So,
well, let me ask for clarity here. In 32, when Hoover increased the taxes, he did. I mean, at that time, the federal income tax deadline, the due dates were different. But somewhere along in there, weren't the taxes made retroactive?
Well, yes. Yeah, very, very good point you made. That was in the tax bill of 1932. It was enacted that year, toward the end of the year, and it was made effective January 1 of 32. And so there was no withholding tax, of course, at that time. And so the tax was all made due and payable on March 15th, on or before March 15th of 1933.
Now that puts us not March 15th, 1933.
Yeah.
I mean, these dates are significant. And let me also say that Hoover has a complete background. You know, you began talking in 1901 with H.G. Wells, and now we're going to the great crash of 29. And there's a lot of history that happened between 1900 and 1929. And my mentor, R. Nelson Nash, I learned from him that you cannot separate economics from history. Behind every great historical event, there's some economics going on behind there. And I digress a little, but so here we are in 1932. Taxes are raised dramatically, and then they're retroactive to March 15th of 1933. Now let's just share with us a little bit of what happens in 1933 in Roosevelt. And this is just a continuation of the construct that was calculated, set in motion, and it continues today, in my opinion. But
March 15th, of course, of 1932 turned out to be a very propitious time, because just before that, we had a so-called run on the banks. Now, why would people be running to the banks to get their money out? It would be to pay taxes. And so in large part, that so-called run on the banks, which what did it give Roosevelt the invitation to do? Shut down the banks. And why would he want to do that? Well, the big banks of Wall Street have always hated the small banks. They want to wipe as many of them out as possible. And that accomplished a good deal of that objective at that time. They could shut down all the banks, which they were shut down, all of them, and they could simply refuse to allow the ones they didn't want to operate. They would just keep them closed. I have not gone into trying to document those individually, but that was the circumstance. It has been the circumstance ever since. The smaller banks still are the adversaries, the enemies, the competition of the big banks of Wall Street. And the big banks of Wall Street still, of course, are the dominating financial force in the country, no doubt about it. And they certainly are, so far as the Federal Reserve is concerned. They own and control the Federal Reserve with minor influence by the smaller banks. But yes, that is exactly the kind of thing that was very important in the time of the Great Depression, and the things that have done that got Roosevelt started in terms of what he was able to do for the big banks and knocking out their competition, also in terms of hurting the middle class. But let me go ahead with some of the additional things.
Sure.
That he did as well. On the matter of tariffs, he appointed a Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who was very well known as being someone who supported strongly international trade. And Cordell Hull was therefore one who wanted to roll back the tariffs. So he's got him as Secretary of State. Cordell Hull immediately organizes an international conference in London for all nations, trading nations, to come, so that there could be an agreement to roll back tariffs across the board and get international trade going again. So he gets that going in July of 1933, only 3 months after they've taken office. And all the nations there, he's got a terrible group of people sent with him by Roosevelt, basically scalawags that were living it up in Paris or London while they were there. But nevertheless, he has the meeting ready to sign an agreement rolling back the tariff rates. And on the day they're about to do it, Roosevelt makes a radio speech from Washington declaring that he will not enter any agreement that provides that he will not devalue the U.S. dollar. Well, devaluing the dollar is like the reverse side of the same coin as the tariff is. It changes the terms of trade very significantly, and therefore, when Roosevelt wouldn't permit anything in the agreement relating to the value of the currency, that means that they can't sign an agreement. Well, everybody got as mad as hornets in London at the international conference. Everyone went home mad, and there was no agreement. In other words, the newspapers, even at the time, said that Roosevelt had torpedoed the attempt to lower tariff rates. Which, of course, is exactly what he did. And so I've told you what he did on taxes. I've told you what he did on tariffs. The next thing is fraud on the markets. Well, fraud on the markets had continued all the way through the Hoover term. And so Roosevelt was making an indication that he was going to do something to stop the fraud. And so in 1933, they passed the 1930 Securities Act, 1933 Securities Act, and basically made it a crime to engage in fraud in the trading of corporate shares. Problem was they didn't define what the penalty was, and they didn't define what fraud was. So it was a useless thing. So the next year, 34, they passed the 1934 Securities Exchange Act and set up the SEC Commission to so-called regulate fraud and to determine what fraud was. And they designed it specifically as a commission with representatives of the financial community to make sure that the big guys never get prosecuted for fraud.
What? I'm shocked.
So you can't do any worse than what FDR did in correcting the three big wrongs that Hoover did. But that's not where Roosevelt stopped. That's just where he started. I told you that he raised taxes every year. But let me run through the other things. One of the things that he started doing immediately upon taking office, this was even when Morgenthau was before he became Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau was head of, I think, what they call the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was more or less a slush fund for spending money in ways that Roosevelt thought was beneficial, so-called, to the economy. And one of the things they started doing immediately was buying gold on the open market on foreign exchange. And so they were taking money that had been raised as tax money and spending it on gold to enhance the amount of gold that the U.S. Treasury had in its vaults. Now, why would they do that when people are starving to death? It is the kind of thing that takes money out of the economy and puts it in storage. Exactly the kind of thing that the comic books used to say Scrooge McDuck would do, and was such a terrible thing for ordinary people because it meant no money in the economy. Well, Roosevelt began doing that immediately in 1933, even at a time when he had already ordered in March of 33 that Americans must turn in their gold coins. Anyone with gold coins had to turn them in for what they paid for them, $20.67. Take them to the bank. You'll get your $20.67 in cash. And that was a criminal law requiring criminal punishment if you were caught to be violating it. And that began immediately. By the end of the year, they pretty much had all the gold that people had invested in. You remember when Smoot-Hawley passed, it caused a lot of factories to be shut down because they couldn't export any longer. A lot of businesses failed, the ones who did import business as well. And when people liquidated their business, sold for cents on the dollar, but whatever money they had left, they couldn't invest again because there was no business for anybody. So they had bought gold to try to protect the value of their purchasing power, because there were rumors that Roosevelt was going to devalue the dollar. And so they were protecting themselves against devaluation. Well, he takes all the gold, and then as soon as he's got it for $20.67 an ounce, he gets it in the U.S. Treasury, and then he devalues the dollar to $35 an ounce of gold. And he takes all of the so-called profits that are already in the Treasury, and he takes that and shifts it over to a secret organization called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, a title that makes it appear that they're going to help the stock market not have fraud. Clearly, that was not going to be the case with the SEC set up as a mechanism to facilitate fraud. So we have that circumstance that we have a secret organization, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, that does whatever it wants still to this day, and we have no report from them as to what they do. And its funds are said to be much, much larger than what it initially got.
The call with Wayne Jett and I went a little bit long, so we decided to split it in half, make 2 parts out of it. So be sure and watch for the second part. We may even have him return in the future to continue our conversation. So thanks for listening. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us on the Banking with Life podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe and click on that little notification bell. Otherwise, join us on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher for weekly content.